Did you really think I wasn't going to make a video on the biggest trade move of the NBA season? I mean, Derrick Rose, the former MVP, Detroit Pistons player, no longer, has gone back to New York. I'm not going to talk about that situation like New York wanted him back on an expiring contract when they've got young guards. I don't know what New York are doing, but I know Detroit have got in Dennis Smith Jr. and a second round pick from Charlotte, which will probably end up being like around the 40 range, which is a pretty solid pick. You can get some decent value from that, so don't just discredit the second round pick. That's a solid return to get for someone who's got half a year left on his contract, has struggled with injuries all his career, and has missed several games already this season struggling with injuries, and isn't having the best year of his career. Thank you for your time in Detroit, D. Rose. You did well. I won't miss the stands who somehow believe that he's still like a top 5 player in the league. Now we got to talk about the man that is newest to the Pistons. Here's something to know about our newest arrival. Like, this is something he prides himself on. Apparently, this is God's gift to what Dennis Smith Jr. has to offer. And, well, I guess you could say this is a pretty diverse squad. Welcome to the squad in Detroit, Dennis Smith Jr. You've got a few different kind of players that might have different gifts as well. I mean, for one, Josh Jackson has a son in the NBA, an all-star son, so that's good to see. You've also got someone who's actually the son of an NBA all-star as well in Rodney McGruder. And then, well, our franchise player spends more time on the Eric Andre show than actually on the basketball court. So when you consider all of those things, to have someone who considers his ability to slang wood his biggest God-gifted trait, as opposed to actually playing basketball, which is what we signed him up to do. I mean, it doesn't really go against the grain, really, when you consider our max player, our franchise player is, spending more time on the Eric Andre show than on the court, or at least being more productive on that show than on the court. But aside from slanging wood, which I'm not going to say that one more time on this channel, I think that'll be the last time you'll ever hear me say that phrase, so that's the last time I'm saying that. Apart from doing that, does Dennis Smith Jr. actually do anything that's going to help us on the basketball court? Well, if you looked at his time in New York, you would probably suggest no. But then if you looked at the time of pretty much 99% of New York's players, you would also probably come to that same conclusion. So we're going to go back a bit further to try and find out what he does well. Can he give us that same upside, that same potential, show us the same signs that a former number 10 overall pick from the same draft that Dennis Smith Jr. was drafted in, Josh Jackson, has shown in Detroit? Is it the place where careers come to not die, but rebuild themselves? That would be a good sign of things. We've already seen a couple of signs that maybe that is the place. That is Detroit. So hopefully that's the place for Dennis Smith Jr. Now, before I go into depth about this, if you could drop a like on the video, subscribing to the channel would also help as well. I make content like this every single day. Just dropping a like, it just helps out how the video goes, so it would be much appreciated. We've got to start with the obvious, and the obvious is the high upside of Dennis Smith Jr. It's only a few years removed from when people thought he was one of the best point guards from the 2017 NBA draft. Not just before the draft, where The Ringer had him ranked as the 6th best prospect. I'm sure other places had him ranked highly as well, but it wasn't just before the draft. After his first season, 40 games into his first season, whenever it was, well, a lot of people seemed to believe that he was potentially the best point guard in the league. I saw people saying, oh, teams messed up not taking Dennis Smith Jr. The New York Knicks were one, of course, because they took Frank Ntilikina instead. People were saying that was a big mistake, but I think there's still definite upside. We've seen it with Josh Jackson, as I alluded to. We've seen it with a number of people in the past where if you got this athleticism that he definitely has, that's what Weaver wants. He wants athleticism. I mean, he's got it in spades, in abundance. He talked about his God-gifted trait being something else, but really it is athleticism, because a 48-inch vertical, that's absolutely insane. He can dunk on pretty much anyone. That's what he prided himself on doing in his first couple of years in Dallas and in college. He is an explosive athlete who can finish at the rim. I think that's something that's important to note. Finishing at the rim in his second year, which is where we're going to take it back to, because, I mean, his last 2 years in New York, the spacing that they had, Julius Randle, Taj Gibson, RJ Barrett, Mo Harkless, Mitchell Robinson. Like, I don't think you could make a worse roster for someone who struggles shooting the ball but likes to get to the rim. Like, you just couldn't. It was possibly the worst constructed roster for Dennis Smith Jr. to thrive. So we're not really going to talk about much of his time in New York, although his second year in the league, where he spent 20 games in New York before they infected him and turned him into the player he currently has been for the last 2 years, he was okay. But yeah, in his second year, he finished at the rim. He was in pretty good company. When you look at other sophomores, the likes of De'Aaron Fox, Donovan Mitchell, he was finishing at around average in terms of guard efficiency for at the rim, and he was doing so on a lot of attempts. Volume. That means he can consistently get to the rim, and I think that's going to be the key to him. As I alluded to, the third year in the league in New York, he struggled getting to the rim. I mean, can you blame him? That spacing was just absolutely non-existent. He had no spacing in New York. in that third season, so he struggled that year. But before then, he did show signs of being a good finisher at the rim, an athletic player who does have potential upside on defense given his athleticism. And I think something else to note is we've talked about how Troy Weaver wants those athletic guys. He wants people of a certain mold. You look at Isaiah Stewart coming through in the draft, Josh Jackson, Jeremy Grant. These are these explosive athletes that can potentially provide upside as defenders and as offensive players. Dennis Smith Jr. definitely has that, but another thing he has is I think he's got self-awareness. If there's one thing to note, it's the fact that he wanted to go into the G League again to prove himself. You could be saying to me, that's just the obvious option. He was struggling, he wasn't getting any game time. Of course he wants to go to the G League. There's a lot of people in the past that would have been top 10 draft picks that would have come into the league and really set the world on fire to a degree. Like, he had a bit of a cult following given his athleticism and the way he started his career in Dallas. You could think a lot of those people wouldn't really want to go down to the G League. They wouldn't have it in them to prove themselves. We saw Josh Jackson do that exact thing, and well, it turned out well for him. But Dennis Smith Jr. wanted to take it upon himself to go to the G League and prove himself, so it means he wants to fight for a spot. He knows what it takes, and maybe it takes playing 5 minutes a night in Detroit and working his way up the roster, because there's definitely going to be game time for him. I don't expect Killian Hayes to come back anytime soon. That's the reality. He's got an injury that could be quite serious if they don't manage it well, and there's absolutely no reason to rush him back. Like, zero reasons to rush him back, so they're not going to do that. Maybe we don't see him to the second half of the season, probably at best at this point in time, so we're not going to see him for a while. That means there's minutes there. At the moment, DeLon Wright's playing 30 minutes a night. Like, we can cut 10 minutes off DeLon Wright straight away. DeLon Wright is a solid player. That is it. We know his ceiling. He's 28 years of age. He's going to give you 8, 5, and 6 or something, which is solid. He's a good backup point guard. Like, I don't mind him as a backup point guard. He is not a starting level NBA point guard. Maybe Dennis Smith Jr. can prove in 15 minutes a night, because Saban Lee's also someone else getting minutes as well. Who, I'm not opposed to him getting minutes, but maybe Dennis Smith Jr. can take those minutes, and all of a sudden, there's like 15 minutes on offer at the point guard spot for Dennis Smith Jr., not to mention at the shooting guard spot, if you navigate a few things with the consistent injuries of Blake Griffin, all of those things, there's space opening up on the floor. There's definitely going to be game time if the coach sees fit. And if he's willing to work for it, he's willing to work on his weaknesses, which we'll talk about his weaknesses because we've talked about his strengths, attacking the rim, decent playmaker as well, has upside as a defender, wants to work on himself. Well, he's going to have to work on a few things, and one of those main things is shooting the ball. You say it with a lot of people, and often that's a reason why they struggle getting game time. He can't shoot the ball. Let's put it as simply as that. He doesn't shoot particularly well at the free throw line, which does suggest to me that maybe he's never going to be a great shooter. He probably never will be a great shooter, but if he can be league average, that's the key. If he can not be a liability, because if you're a liability from three, like we've seen it with Russell Westbrook, who is all world in every aspect of NBA basketball, apart from shooting the ball, we've seen him be a liability in playoff situations because he can't shoot the ball. Dennis Smith Jr. is the same thing, but he doesn't have the other Russell Westbrook things, so you're going to have to be a solid shooter. 35%, you're going to have to get somewhere around there where teams aren't going to sag off on you, because unfortunately, no matter how much you turn your career around, you're not going to get to the point where you can be a non-threat from beyond the arc. I just don't think that can be a thing for Dennis Smith Jr., so hopefully he's worked on that. Another thing is his shot selection. He takes a lot of mid-range shots. I'm not particularly opposed to the mid-range shot like a lot of people seem to be. Like, when you can't actually make mid-range shots, don't take them. It's quite simple. When you can't make shots, don't take them. I know you could say the same thing for a three ball, but a three ball is important in today's league. That's just the reality. A mid-range shooter when you're shooting 20% isn't ideal. So stop shooting mid-range shots. That's good. Refine your shot selection. Hopefully you're going to have more driving opportunities in Detroit. He's in his 4th year in the league. I mean, I can look at countless point guards. If there's one position where you think players sometimes take a long time to figure it out in the NBA, particularly guys who are probably a bit on the smaller end of things because you can't use your size and you've got to kind of navigate angles and different aspects of the game to finish over people or to find your spots on the floor. We've seen it with other small point guards or just other point guards in general. I mean, Steve Nash and Kyle Lowry, two bona fide Hall of Famers, well, they didn't average double-digit scoring until their 5th year in the league. Dennis Smith Jr. is in his 4th. He's already averaged double-digit scoring, but he hasn't figured things out. Well, it took other Hall of Fame point guards like multiple years to figure it out. Am I saying he's going to be a Hall of Fame point guard? No, you know I'm not saying that. But am I saying that at 4 years into his career, considering last year was kind of a wipe as well, a scratch, he's really only had 2 solid seasons where he's shown signs of good things. Like, he's shown signs of being a decent NBA player. Am I willing to say his career is lost? No, I still think there's a lot of potential for someone who was so good out of college and obviously was pretty good in his first 2 years in the league. I mean, there's every chance nothing really comes of this. Maybe Dennis Smith Jr. turns out to be, unfortunately, a bust. I don't really like using that label because I think it's just harsh, but, well, let's be honest. If he's out of the league in 5 years, he's a bust. I'm sorry to say that. But at the same time, people thought Josh Jackson was done. He went to the G League, he came back, he went to Memphis, and then he turned his career around. Now he's turning his career around in Detroit as well. He's just removed from the same draft as Dennis Smith Jr. I've already told you about how point guards can sometimes take a long time to develop. He's just going to have opportunity in Detroit. Like, no one's going to complain if he's taking 10 minutes a night off Delon Wright and 5 minutes off Saben Lee. Then he can work his way up. Maybe he becomes a starter by the end of the year. Like, crazier things have happened. But at the very worst case scenario, you still get a top 40 pick or so for Derrick Rose, who was on an expiring contract. He probably wasn't going to resign in Detroit. He hasn't even really played the last 5 or so games. Like, what else can you really get for him? You've got a potential high upside guy. Maybe he doesn't pan out. Maybe he does. But we've said the same things with a couple of guys on this roster. And you give Troy Weaver the benefit of the doubt because he's done things that people didn't like at the time and now they've turned around. Although a lot of people like this Dennis Smith Jr. move because people are kind of enamored with his possibilities given his ability to just yam on people like that. I mean, you can't complain. If you can get him just dunking on people, that'll work. So Dennis Smith Jr. is traded to the Detroit Pistons. That's my thoughts on the thing. I think it's a high upside move, low risk really. Like, what do you have to lose? You're getting rid of Derrick Rose on an expiring contract. The time was right. I don't mind the move at all. Second round pick. Yep, cool. Detroit Pistons, Detroit basketball. Have a good day. Catch you next time. Bye.